Psalm 23 today, and I trust that you know today that God is everything you need, and I hope as a result of our time today you'll sense that more acutely. Psalm 23, and I trust that today you've had a good day, and already God has spoken to you through His Word and Spirit, and looking forward to this morning what God will do in my heart and yours as we share around His Word. If you would join me in standing for a moment, Psalm 23 will begin in verse 1, and as we've been doing, read through the psalm and then focus on the next phrase in the sequence today. Psalm 23, and let's begin in verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for Thou art with me. Thy rod and Thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. If you would, please go back to verse number 2. We're going to focus on the first half of this verse today. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. And this morning, for a few minutes, we'll look at this subject together as we're talking about unloading unnecessary type of luggage and baggage. Today, look at this, unloading the baggage or the burden of weariness. Unloading the baggage and burden of weariness. Let's pray and ask the Lord to help us today. Father, thank you for the joy it is to be here today. Lord, I thank you for these that are here, new folks you've brought our way, as well as those who faithfully have attended and served in this place. We pray for our young people and the other respective ministries going on right now, that you would give grace and wisdom to those ministering to our kids. And fathers, we now enter this time of study. We pray you'd help us, Lord, to hear from you today. Lord, to sense from you what will, I believe, eradicate what is a bone, soul level kind of weariness. And Lord, it would be replaced and replenished with your sweet presence and provision in our lives. And Lord, I pray you'd help us to realize today that, God, our weariness is not a badge to wear and honor, but Lord, it is a burden and it is an indicator of a disjointed, disconnected relationship with you. And I pray you'd help us to stop glorying in it or just tolerating it, and instead to recognize that, Lord, you have answers and solutions that will soothe us and comfort us and replenish us in our walk with you. Move and work in our midst today. Be with those that are especially worn down and burnt out, as we would say. Give them comfort and conviction and challenge today. And we'll thank you and praise you for it in Christ's name. Amen. You may be seated. Thank you. I always find it interesting how God always lines up things perfectly. And I had already put together kind of the sequence of our study. I usually do that at the end. I'm already starting on our sequence for next year as far as sermon schedule. And God will tweak that now and then. But this series has been put together for several months as far as the schedule. And today is Labor Day, this weekend. I didn't really think of that. So if you think I'm a genius, I know there's no one out there still thinking that. Just give it a few weeks if you're new. But it's just amazing how God just coalesces those things together. And so today, on this Labor Day weekend, we're going to look at how to unload the weariness that often comes on the heels of the labor we're doing for the Lord. The other day, someone shared with me a little anecdote or quote that I thought just portrays how we often feel in our busy society. Someone said this, quote, "I am not an early bird or a night owl. I'm some form of a permanently exhausted pigeon." And I don't know how you feel, but I'll be honest with you, much of my existence tends to fall not into the night owl or the early bird, but into the exhausted pigeon category. And can I just tell you, caught into my opening prayer today, I think for many of us, we see that as almost a godly thing. We're busy, we're hectic, we're worn down, and if we're not, we almost feel bad that we're not. If we ever have a moment of rest or renewal. And I would say today that for many of us, what we see as a badge of honor is actually a burden and is an indicator of where something is off between us and the Good Shepherd. And I found this to be true. Typically, when we're weary, we tend to operate under the authority of what's been referred to as the tyranny of the urgent. We're only thinking of the immediate. How do I survive the next 5 minutes with these kids? How do I get through the next 10 minutes of this long meeting at work. I don't know, whatever the context, maybe it's some doctor appointment or pain you're going through or some other setting that you're dealing with. And I think what often happens is we get so caught up in the present when we're weary that we forget some things we need to remember. And I want to share with you some of these things today God's been teaching me I've never seen before connected to the word Sabbath that are found in Scripture. And so we're going to study a bit about how our remembrance and how reflecting on what God has done for us can renew us and replace weariness with rest and peace. The first text we're going to turn to this morning is found in Exodus chapter 20. Would you turn there and let's talk about God making us lie down in green pastures, specifically pastures that are defined by Sabbath rest kind of principles. Exodus chapter 20, if you would please. And we're going to look at verse 8 through 11. Exodus chapter 20. We'll spend a few minutes in Deuteronomy as well. Exodus chapter 20, and if you would please, verse number 8. God here on the tail end of the 10 Commandments, as we refer to them, the Decalogue, these 10 primary commands given from God on the Mount to Moses and therefore to the people. Notice what he says in verse number 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that are in them is, and rested the seventh day, wherewith the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So we're going to look at today two memories we need to have. The first one is in Exodus 20, the second Deuteronomy chapter 5, that I believe if we'll remember these things about God, these are things He's done for us, it will unload the burden of weariness. The first thing we need to remember and rest in is the fact that God has made us. Rest in divine creation. And in Exodus chapter number 20, verses 8 to 11, the motivation or the context in which Sabbath rest was to occur was with the reflection and remembrance upon the reality, God has made me. God made me, He made my son, He made my manservant, my maidservant, He made the cattle, He made everything listed there, and therefore we rest in the realities that He has made us. Remember we read just a moment ago in Psalm 23, He maketh me. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. God has made you, and therefore because He made you, it requires a rest that replaces weariness with this soothing realities of what God has promised. And here in verse 11, Israel was instructed to observe this day of rest, to commence God's rest in creation. And we now as His people must do the same, reflecting upon the fact that He has made us. Now, that sounds a bit abstract if we're honest. Okay, Pastor, I still have bills and work and relational responsibilities and even ministry things. How does the reality, or reflecting on the fact God has made me, how does that replace weariness with rest? First thing that teaches us or reminds us is that God has created us and therefore He's created us with limitations. There are limits to what we are able to do. There are boundaries that God Himself has ordained, not man has ordained, that we must respect and live in light of. What is the mantra of our day? Busyness is next to what? Godliness. I was reading the other day, Thomas Edison was known to get through a whole day with a 15-minute nap, maybe twice during that 24-hour period, and he's our hero. What often we forget is the Albert Einstein type people. I was reading about Albert Einstein. They said he would sleep more than 11 or 12 hours a day. And sometimes we focus on the Edison people, and I have to be that, and why should I sleep when I could be doing or accomplishing something? But God has created us with the desire and also the need to respect the boundaries that He has given. And I think many of us today, we are tired because of it. This mindset of busyness is next to godliness. Our minds are tired. Our bodies are tired, and I think most importantly, our souls are tired. You ever tried to read the Bible on a few minutes of sleep the night before, maybe sit in church? I hope you realize today's not the day to fall asleep in church, all right? If so, the altar will be wide open for you after church. The guy who nudges you will remind you of that. But anyway, isn't it amazing how church is different when you're rested as opposed to not? Just your relationship with your family at work. I'm sure this is me sometimes in our setting here at church, but you can usually tell when I didn't get the best rest the night before. It affects my productivity. And so God has created and embedded into creation the need for and recognition of limitations. I want to give you two things today underneath of this. These are not on the slides, but if you jot down, these are two swaps you can make. You can trade in weariness for two things when you recognize God has given you limitations. Number one, trade in weariness for limiting labor. Go back to verse 9 here in our text. First, you can trade in weariness for limiting labor. There's a limit to the labor that you do. Look at verse 9. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. Last time I checked, there's more than 6 days in a week, right? There's 7. My own mindset, and this maybe be a help to you in structuring your week, is I think for every person, there ought to be 5 days, in my view, is the ideal. I know sometimes with swing shifts and other things, this can vary. But I think 5 days, or the equivalent of 5 days work for vocational effort, 1 day for personal, managing of your household, other work-related obligations in your personal space. And for 6 days you labor, but then there has to be this day of rest. And God has instructed us to follow His word in this area. It is a labor that is effort, there's sweat, but there's also limits to how much we work in what God has entrusted to us. And I think for some of us, our weariness is, some of you, you're not struggling with the type A issues that I have today. Your challenge may be today, you've yet to find your life work. To have rest means you got to have something to work for 6 days that means something. Are you working today in what God has called you to work in? The field He's put you, with everything you've got for those 6 days, you're working in your family setting and in your vocational setting and ministry setting, and then there is this day of rest. I think to rest, you have to have a labor that God has given. And so we rest from a labor, but a labor that God has entrusted. Jeremiah 5 and verse 22 says, "Fear ye not me, saith the Lord, will ye not tremble at my presence, which has placed the sand for the bound of the sea by a perpetual decree, that it cannot pass it. And though the waves thereof toss themselves, yet they shall not prevail. Though they roar, yet they shall not pass over it." Even the ocean, God has created boundaries for. And some of you, the reason you're weary today is you're trying to push boundaries that even the ocean can't move. And I'm telling you, you know who's going to win? It's not going to be you. It's going to be the shoreline, the limitation of what you're able to do. And so we wear ourselves thin by not having labor that is limited. Until you today and I today embrace the fact that God created, even in a perfect world, limits, you will never be able to embrace and experience the rest that God can provide. I would like you to think about today and maybe go home and reflect on this as I've had to do. Where are moments that God would give me rest if I'd stop doing what I do right now during that time? Well, where are moments of my week that I'm filling it? We'll talk about some other things we fill it with in just a moment, but I'm not giving God room to renew me. And we need to be more strategic and intentional, as God clearly indicates in the text. All right, number 2, a second trade that we can make when we recognize we've been created with limits. Trade in weariness for limiting labor. Number 2, trade in weariness for limiting dependence. Look at verse 10. "But if the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, in it thou shalt not do any work." And he goes on to describe, that means everything and everyone in your life is not to work on that seventh day. There is a dependence that comes from resting. God knows us well, doesn't He? I love that He goes into such detail in verse 10, because a lot of us that maybe are in charge of a business or have some responsibility, okay, well, maybe I can take off, but I'm going to have someone else working during that time. And just idling, just stopping and letting everyone regroup and refresh. And so He goes through each of these people and categories and says, listen, everyone must acknowledge this law and this limitation. And I think God's message is clear here as He goes on in verse number 11 that we'll get to in more detail in just a moment. He says, if God can rest and creation goes on without Him actively engaged, your world will go on as well. And I give you a statement today. It may seem very simple but blunt, and here it is. It's not my job to run the world. I've come to terms with that. I can't run your world. I can't run my world. I can't run the world. All I can do is manage what God's put right in front of me. I cannot run the world. And if God takes the time to rest after creating the world, even in perfection, and to let it just go through these natural cycles, should we not do the same? Following in the path that He has given us by way of example. One of the articles I was reading was talking about in this analogy of sheep here in Psalm 23 that most animals have very little difficulty going to sleep or resting. Dogs, they sleep when probably they should be watching your house. Bears, they hibernate for months. And most animals are very easily bedded down at night. They're very easily put into a stupor of rest and sleep and renewal. There's one animal or one being besides we human beings that struggle with sleeplessness. You don't know what that animal is? Sheep. And the article was talking about that their environment has to be perfect. If there's a lot of insects, if the ground isn't right, if the environment is not just perfect, the sheep will just keep roaming, and even as they're tired and worn out, they will not bed down for the night. And the idea here is that we need someone to intervene on our behalf. The reason we don't rest is because we think it all depends upon us. If I don't take care of this, if I don't do this, I'll not be able to rest tonight. Some of the sweetest moments I've had of rest have been in the most crisis moments in my life. I'll not go into them for sake of time, but my wife will attest the fact when something's wrong, I want to do something about it. That's just how I'm wired. But when I've experienced rest is when sometimes things have been the most difficult. And there's tons of things I could do, but just being willing to let God work in that situation. Some of you, listen to me, you're too proud. You're too self-dependent. And that's why you're wearing yourselves out. God can bear a burden you can't bear. We talked about that last week. God can shoulder things you can't shoulder. And to rest means we must depend upon Him. And so a Sabbath kind of rest means, God, I'm going to rest in you. I'm going to rely upon you. You can do what I am unable to do. Sheep cannot find safe pasture on their own. They cannot spray insecticide. They cannot deal with frictions or find food on their own. They need help. And our shepherd promises to give that to us to lead to rest. I was reading the other day, an author was talking about, and this is my mindset with anything that breaks technology-wise. My boys will come and say, hey, Dad, this isn't working, or this is, and I always will, and now they don't even ask, I'll say, did you unplug it? That's my great tech support. So if you would call me and want tech support, that's all I got. Did you try unplugging it or turning it off? The other day I heard an author say this, almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. There are things that could work, there are things that could go. If you would just disengage for a moment, let God renew you, what could work? What could happen if you would yield to Him? All right, now, secondly, if you will, go to verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, right? This is the foundation of our rest, that He has created us, the sea, all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore, notice this, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Number two, so we're created with limitations. That's where we have to work within those boundaries. Here's the reason that we're able to rest. We have been created not to perform, but to be holy. Our motivation and our mission in life is not to get a bunch of tasks done. It's not to put out a bunch of fires. It's to become holy even as He is holy. And in verse number 11, God gave the purpose for this Sabbath. It wasn't just so things would idle down. It was so that everyone would be more holy, would be more set apart and sanctified and set upon who He was and what He wanted them to be. So a couple years ago, we were down, is it Guggisburg? Is that it, the cheese place down near Charm? And we were in the shop there, and we were just walking around, get as many free samples as we could without spending any money, being the cheapskate that I am. And we walked over, and they were making cheese, and they had have you seen that, where they're making cheese, the big sign about the fact that they invented a type of cheese? Have you seen this? Did you know this? Baby Swiss was invented in 1960 by Guggisburg. What's his first name? The guy, was it Alex? I think is the guy's first name. It's something for you to learn today locally, all right? But he invented it. It's my favorite kind of Swiss cheese. Regular Swiss is kind of strong, especially if you just take a chunk off and eat it. And I love it. It's good cheese, but I didn't realize he invented it. But Baby Swiss has holes in it, but they're normally smaller holes, right? It's not quite as big old gaping holes, the yeast and all that goes in making cheese. And I think it's interesting as we think about rest and this idea of holiness, and that's not what that's talking about for the record, okay? Guggisburg was not on God's mind when he said that verse of hallowing or making holy. But I think for us, a lot of us, it is the small holes, if you will, through which our rest and our renewal is leaking out. And because we're not consecrating all of our lives and every nuance of our being to God in this idea of holiness, I don't think for most of us it's coming out in a gush on one front. And I'm just worn out because this one thing is an issue. It's the drip in multiple things and on multiple fronts that's leading us to be worn down by the circumstances around us. Isaiah 57 and verse 20, God speaking says, "The wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters," I love this imagery, "cast up mire and dirt. There is no peace, saith my God, to the wicked." And I hate to be blunt with you this morning, but for a lot of you, and this issue is for me as well, the reason we don't have rest is because we refuse to be like God. We refuse to be separated from sin that wears us down. We watch things, we listen to things, we talk about things, and it's vexing us, as described in Lot in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. We're vexing our righteous soul. And where there should be rest, there's carnality. Where there should be rest, there is pride and indifference to the defilement of this world. And so there is a lack of rest for many of us today because there's a lack of holiness. Now, I don't want to go to seed on this, but as you kind of just peruse down through Exodus 20, isn't it amazing how succinct God is with example, verse 13, "Thou shalt not kill." How many words is that? 4. "Thou shalt not commit adultery." Few words. But God takes 8, 9, 10, and 11, 4 verses to talk about rest. There's something to that. And there's something to that because the rest leads us to be in compliance with much of the other aspects of the Ten Commandments. That struck me. 4 verses for Sabbath rest and 4 words for "thou shalt not kill." That's not what I'm thinking as far as valuation of which is more important. But God takes 4 verses because he knows if we rest and if we renew, that we will be like him and we will please him and we will honor him. A couple things about that we can swap out weariness for if we realize we're created for holiness. Number 1, jot this down, trade in weariness for God's holy blessing. Did you notice that in verse 11 it says, "Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day"? Trade in weariness for holy blessing. I don't know if did you notice the Ryan's restaurant closed here in town? Did you notice that? I don't know why I'm on the food bent. That's probably not a good thing for a preacher to do. Did you see that? Ryan's closed, I think, here in town. And now there's all this debate about what restaurant should go in there. And some of you have been floating ideas to me of what you think should go in there. I have a few of my own, but as a parent of adolescent boys to be, one of my biggest that I'd love to see be a Chick-fil-A. I don't know, any of you agree with me? Would you raise your hand? I know you like a sit-down restaurant. We got some of those, let's get something, else. And so I've been pushing for that. I saw these other restaurants go in and I'm like, we have 2 of now this restaurant we still don't have, and I got a list of about 5 I'd love to see move to our area. But one of the things that's fascinating to me about Chick-fil-A, I was on their website a few months ago. You know that Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays, right? Have you seen that? And there's some reasons for that. And on their website, they had just a little snippet. Their founder, Truett Cathy, they said, made the decision to close on Sundays in 1946 when he opened his first restaurant in Hapeville, Georgia. He has often shared his decision was as much practical as spiritual. He believed that all franchise Chick-fil-A operators and their restaurant employees should have an opportunity to rest, spend time with their family and friends, and worship if they choose to do so. And they said, quote, "That's why Chick-fil-A restaurants are still closed on Sundays. It's part of our recipe for success." And I think we've kind of discarded that in our day, and we don't realize that there's more than just the physical component. There's the spiritual significance and what God can do when we separate from busyness and we're separated unto God. Trade in weariness for God's blessings. And one of the things I find interesting is their restaurant is booming. That's the worst model in the world. Any of you who've been in the food industry know that. Sunday's a big day for income, but God has blessed them. May we trade in weariness of trying to get in 7 days, listen to me, what God can give you in 6. More that he can give you. Not in a prosperity kind of way, but God can enrich your life if you'll stop trying to do it all on your own and you trade in weariness for his blessing. And here's the statement I would give you. At some point in your life, I'm still working through this. I'm saying it, and as I'm saying it, thinking, you still got some work to do. Here it is. At some point, you have to pick between what you can do and what God can do. At some point, you have to choose, and I have to choose. Am I going to go with everything I can do, But I want everything God can do. And if you want everything God can do, his full blessing, you have got to get it figured out in this area of weariness, to rest in him, waiting on him to give you what he only gives to those who truly know what it means to rest. May I say this morning, years from now, you'll be light years from where you would be if you just do what you can do. God can take you places and show you things and do things through you if you'll just rest instead of just work. Charles Spurgeon once, several years ago, over a century ago, was giving his preaching students some advice, and he said this, quote, "Even beasts of burden must be turned out to grass occasionally. The very sea pauses at ebb and flow. Earth keeps the Sabbath of the wintry months. And man, even when exalted to God's ambassador, must rest or faint, must trim his lamp or let it burn low, must recruit his vigor or grow prematurely old. In the long run, we shall do more by sometimes doing less." And so God wants to bless us and use us and not do less but more, but we must rest in him. And here's why I've come to terms with it. To receive all that God wants to do in my life, I've got to stop doing so much and instead rest in him and let him guide me and lead me into what he would have me to do and to be. All right, now if you will, go back to our text and look at the end of verse 11. So he blessed the Sabbath, notice, and hallowed it. And hallowed it. The word hallow that's found here means to be set apart, to be consecrated, to be hallowed, to be consecrated, to be, and the word that I found interesting was the word taboo, where there's a taboo to it. The idea is that some things are off limits or out of bounds. Have you ever played the game? Isn't there a game called Taboo? And you get, in the game, you have, I think, a card with the word you're trying to get everybody to guess, and you can't say that word, and then there's a list of like 5 derivatives of that word that you also can't say, or close word synonyms. And it's so funny, you get, I remember playing it, and you get so caught, you just say the word before they say it, because you just, come on, you can do it. But there's words that are off limits. For many of us, I think in the area of Sabbath, where we struggle is we don't know how to say no. The idea of God hallowing the Sabbath, how much of it does he spend in verses 8 to 11 telling what to do on the Sabbath? He actually doesn't say anything in this text, but he tells us some things not to do. And I think the reason we're weary is we don't know how to say no. Now, don't say no to the pastor, that's off limits, but I'm talking other people. I'm just kidding. But when people ask or needs or opportunities and we just blindly go into them without seeking the Lord and seeking his guidance and provision, and over time we wear ourselves down because we're not able to say no, we're not able to hallow this season of rest. This day of rest was not a slothful time, it was a spiritual time. It was religious observance and sacrifices and doing it as unto the Lord. And too often our rest time is about us and what we can't say no to instead of yielding and sacrificing and worshiping the Lord. All right, can I give you a succinct statement to jot down before we move on? Here it is, jot this down. Your weariness will never leave until you realize how God made you. Your weariness will never leave until you realize how God made you. And if you can figure out he made you and how he made you, you're well on your way to unloading weariness of your soul. Your weariness will never leave until you realize how God made you. He made you with limits, and he made you for holiness. Those things ought to be what define you. All right, number 2, if you will, now go to Deuteronomy chapter 5, and let's spend a few minutes in the parallel passage that brings out something else to remember as we try to idle down and we try to consecrate some time to the Lord in this area of rest. Deuteronomy chapter 5. And if you would, please, verse 12. And Deuteronomy basically is just a review of God's law and instruction to the nation of Israel before Moses moves off the scene. He's the guy who got it at the mouth, from the mouth of God, and wrote it and had it written on stones and brought it to the people. Now he's reviewing it in Deuteronomy 5. And there's an interesting alteration, or I guess expansion, of the concept of Sabbath rest found here in Deuteronomy chapter 5. If you would, please, look at verse number 12. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee. 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work. The 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thine ox, nor thine ass, nor any of thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates, that thy manservant and thy maidservant may rest as well as thou. Verse 15, notice this change now. And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm, and therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. All right, so number one, we can rest by remembering that God has made us. We rest in divine creation. Number two, we rest in divine redemption. We rest in divine creation. Number two, we rest in divine redemption. Now, by the way, in Psalm 23, it says, He maketh me to lie down in where? Green pastures. Where do we deserve to be? Barrenness at best, burnt at worst. We don't deserve to be in a green place. We don't deserve to be in a place of God's provision, and yet through redemption, we have been given that privilege. We had one of our young guys over to our house last Sunday night after church, and we just kind of impromptu gathering, and we were just hanging out, got some pizza, and we got done eating, and it was time for my boys to go to bed the first Sunday night that was a school night, and so it was like a little after 9, a little bit later than normal for them, but we said, okay, time for bed, and they didn't want to go to bed, as is typical at that age. We send them to bed, we're standing there, we're talking still, and I don't know how long we were all thinking we would continue to fellowship, but as soon as they went upstairs, I started yawning. And you know, when one starts yawning, and I just started laughing. I'm like, I'm really not trying to scoot you out the door. It's not like I go to bed at 9:15 on a Sunday night, but we were tired. We were exhausted. It had been a full day. The other day, someone told me, they said, quote, I can't believe how old people are that are my age. You ever been around someone and just, wait, how old are you again? I thought you were much older than me. You know, just your lack of energy and your lack of vitality. Isn't it amazing how you just feel it just leaking out? See, our weariness is not just a result of misunderstanding that God has made us. Here it is. It's also misunderstanding how sin is unmaking us. God has made us with limits and boundaries. And what we don't realize, there's also attrition. We are being unmade by our sin. We're being unmade by the curse and just living in this sin-cursed world. We need redemption. We need intervention. We need a change. And God says, listen, remember, not only did I make you, but I remade you. I brought you out of the world. I brought you out of sin and bondage. And I want to bring you into the land of promise. And here in Deuteronomy, the reason for observing the Sabbath is not creation. It is the redemption of Israel from Egypt. It is this exit that leads to an entrance. And for us to rest in Christ, we must remember that God has given us redemption. All right, a couple things about that. All right, that's abstract. How do we apply that? Number one, we remember that God has redeemed us with His power. Look, if you will, back in our text in verse 15. And remember thou, when thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt. All right, you got nothing to offer. You're in bondage. And that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence, notice this, through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. God redeems us with power. Number one, if you would, in this idea of trading out weariness, we can trade in weariness for a powerful hand. Trade in weariness for a powerful hand. Now, we haven't talked about this yet, but in this day, David, who wrote Psalm 23, his vocation, remember we talked about this, was what? He was a shepherd. And David was acutely aware of the fact that a green pasture did not just happen. You didn't wander into it. You didn't just find it. In fact, you couldn't find it just growing naturally somewhere in Palestine. Rocks had to be moved. Animals had to be pushed out, and there had to be a development of that property and a coddling of that land and planting and watering that to produce grass. It took intervention on the shepherd's part. And for us today to be in green pasture that's God's pasture, it cost him dearly. And he did so through his own power, not through our merit and our working, or we just wandered into it kind of arbitrarily. God has done much for us to find this pasture and to live and dwell in such a restful place. And so David knew that as he used this imagery of green pastures, he wasn't thinking of some subdivision that you hire a guy to come in and fertilize and mow it. He was thinking in his own mind of what he had done to prepare that for his own sheep, and God has done that for us. And what David says here in Psalm 23 is, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He has done the work. He has provided. My shepherd, David is saying in Psalm 23, makes me lie down in his finished work. And so I give you two things here underneath of this, trading in, first of all, weariness for a powerful hand. Think of the hands of Jesus Christ, what it took for his hands to create for us and to redeem for us salvation. There are a few thorns involved and a few piercings and a few moments of sorrow and weariness on his own part, but he did so for you and he did so for me. I was having lunch this past week with the sheriff in our county, and we were just talking, and I was hearing what was on his heart and mind. We haven't met for a little while, and we meet periodically, and I said to him, are you noticing, as I am in the news, the issues we're having with heroin? He said, yeah, to say the least, that's an understatement. In fact, there was a heroin bust. I think some of you would know more about this. I think we were meeting in a restaurant. It was just over the hill from where we were meeting for lunch that occurred this last week. I think it was this last week or earlier or late last week. And so we were talking about some details, and I said to him, as a pastor, I said, what can we do to help? How do we get on top of this? How do we deal with this? And I just kind of created an open-ended question, and I didn't give him my own thoughts or my own opinions, as sometimes I'm tempted to do. And he said, to be honest with you, he said, the issue is not in law enforcement, the issue is not in counseling. He said this, until Jesus is invited into that life and that heart, we'll never fix this problem. And he said any of the other ones like it. And it just was striking to me. Here's a man who's involved on the front lines of things I can't imagine he deals with daily and his deputies. And he said the answer is Jesus Christ. Our gospel, the redemption that we have, is the only large, big, can handle it easily kind of solution. And Jesus has given us a powerful hand, a hand that can secure for us anything that we're waiting upon. And I think our weariness is we're trying with our own hands to muster up something that only God can ultimately do. All right, then you notice he says in verse 15, not only is it a mighty hand, but it's a stretched out arm. Number two, we can trade in weariness, not just for a powerful hand, but for a powerful arm. Powerful arm. We know today that the Sabbath does not mean for the New Testament believer what it meant for the Old Testament believer. You know that, right? At the moment of the resurrection, now Christians or believers now began to rest or to sanctify a day to the Lord as the first day of the week. The Sabbath was on the seventh day. And what's interesting, just a side note, you can study this out in your own time, all the other 10 commandments are found in the New Testament, but the Sabbath is not. Because there's a new soul level rest, there's a new feel to our time of rest and renewal because of these outstretched arms, this strong and mighty arm that has secured for us salvation and God's embrace and relationship with Him. And there is a weariness we can lose when we know that God's arm is our Redeemer. God's arm has secured for us a position with Him. And there's no greater stretch than God stooping to save us, to bring us into this pasture, to bring us into this place of rest in salvation. And may I say today, to achieve soul-level rest requires for you to live in light of these outstretched hands and arms of Jesus Christ and to allow them to give you a rest that will enter eternity and you'll experience forever. C.S. Lewis was once quoted as saying this, once a man is united with God, how can he not live forever? If his hands have reached us, if his arms have included us, no one can move us from that. No one can take us out of the pasture. No one can separate us from his love, as Romans declares. We are united with this God. And so we're redeemed with power. How much of you today, your life is defined by your power? I just don't feel like I can. I don't have. I'm not able. I hear those things come out of my own mouth over and over again, and I think that's the limit of the resources available. I've said it, I'll say it again. Can God? The question is always answered with, God can. It's not about what you can do and what I can do. It's what could God do? What has God done? And therefore, what could He do? We've been redeemed with the power of God. And if God can rescue us from sin, He can more than able deliver us from the circumstances, no matter how difficult they may be or feel this morning. All right, now lastly, if you will go back to our text, and there's a second area that we've been redeemed, or that should affect us, knowing that we've been redeemed by God in this area of rest. Look, if you will, back at our text at the end of verse 15. Therefore the Lord thy God, with this in mind, therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee, there's the word, commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. Number two, we've been redeemed for the purpose of obedience. We have been redeemed for the purpose of obedience. One of the things that's interesting about the life and ministry of Jesus Christ is that it talks about several places where he says the Son of Man hath nowhere to lay his head. Jesus Christ, his earthly ministry was not one of convenience. He didn't have the helicopter I alluded to a moment ago. He didn't have the PR campaign. He didn't have the conveniences of a high-profile type of personality. He didn't even have somewhere that he could call his own to lay his head. And in Philippians chapter 2, in the midst of that weariness, it says, he being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And it's through his obedience that we have the power to be obedient. The other day, someone shared with me a picture that had this quote on it that it just convicted me. I'll be honest, it convicted me, and maybe we'll do the same for you today. But it said this: what is a bad day? Was it a bad day? Or was it a bad 5 minutes that you've milked all day? See, I think what we're doing is we're defining our existence by our failures that happen in a moment or someone else fails us, and that's all that defines us. Wow, that is pretty wearisome to carry that burden. What about the obedience of Jesus Christ that has present and future implications that all of them are good? And his obedience and his redemption leads us to please God and experience what he has to offer. We grow weary because we overreact to our mistakes or the mistakes of others instead of resting in the ultimate and enabling obedience of Jesus Christ. We've been redeemed to be obedient, to be able to measure up to what God has given us to measure up to. All right, 2 things I give you on that. Number 1, trade in weariness for obedient sanctification. Trade in weariness for obedient sanctification. Go back to our text, and if you would, please look at the beginning of verse 12. Deuteronomy 5:12, keep the Sabbath day, notice this, to sanctify it. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it. We can trade in weariness for obedient sanctification. The word keep that's found here carries the idea to prepare, to put in order, to observe, or to celebrate. And here's the idea. God, the God of our rest, he is the one who hallows the day of rest. All right, that's his responsibility. He's made it holy. He's invited us into it. But God, as our Redeemer, enables us to make the decision of rest, the ability to rest in what he has done, not in us, but in him, and being able to please and honor him. I want to give you 2 things very quickly. I know our time is fast going here. 2 things that will help you be more sanctified in your life. Here it is. Number 1, set apart your personal space from the world. Set apart your personal space. You can't control your work environment. I get that, as far as at large. What's said, what's listened to, but control your personal space. Don't blame someone else where you could sanctify with music, with preaching, with other conversation and influences, maybe something on the wall, something that affects and enhances it on a spiritual level. Set apart your personal space from the world. And I alluded to it a moment ago, but Lot did not do that. And I think that's what wore him down to the point he was so worn down, he didn't have the ability to say no to his daughters committing incest with him in a cave. He had been so worn down and vexed his righteous soul that he had not the ability to separate from the world. Some of the greatest soul weariness in our lives comes not from our labor, but from our leisure time. I'm not just talking at work, I'm talking in your personal space. What do you listen to? What do you watch? What do you talk about? Get the world out of it. It only brings weariness. Number 2, jot this down if you will, set apart your personal space for the Lord. Set apart your personal space for the Lord. You're in Deuteronomy, hold your place there. Go to Psalm, would you very quickly, Psalm 63. And I give you one example from the lips of David of how he did this and the rest that came. Psalm 63, and if you would please, verse 1. All right, just a couple practical things to sanctify and to keep this idea of rest. How to be more rest-filled and not as weary-laden. Psalm 63, and if you will, verse 1. I'm just going to pull out a couple of verses for sake of time. Verse 1 of Psalm 63, O God, this is David, by the way, when he was in the what of Judah? The wilderness, all right? He's not in some plush palace somewhere. "O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is." He wasn't using just poetic language. He's literally saying, I'm in a desperate place. I need you. Go down, if you will, to verse 4. "Thus will I bless thee while I live. I will lift up my hands in thy name. My soul shall be satisfied with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise thee with joyful lips." Now notice verse 6. "When I remember thee upon my bed," that's pretty personal, that space, "and meditate on thee in the night watches, because thou hast been my help. Therefore in the shadow of thy wings I will rejoice. My soul followeth hard after thee. Thy right hand upholdeth me. But those that seek my soul shall destroy it. They shall go in the lower parts of the earth." He goes on to talk about, verse 11, "The king shall rejoice in God." He rested in God by allowing God into his personal space. Sanctify your personal space unto the Lord. Don't just give your work to the Lord. Give him intentional seasons of rest and reflection. Don't just kick up your feet and let you do what you want to do. Let God into that space. Let him renew you in those times of personal renewal. Trade in weariness for obedient sanctification. And then lastly, number 2, trade in weariness for obedient clarity. Trade in weariness for obedient clarity. There was a story came out of London this last week. They had it was a wrestling match, and it was a wrestling match raising monies for a charity. And what was interesting about the story was they weren't just doing typical wrestling, with the padded gear and traditional setting. They were wrestling they had taken a skating rink, they normally fill with water, and they fill it with gravy. London people are known for gravy. If you don't know that, that's a huge part of their diet. And so these contestants are wrestling in gravy. And what was crazy was they had some pictures, and they're wearing tuxes and real nice clothing. It wasn't like they came in, wearing a wife beater and a, whatever. They had dressed up, walked in, and then, man, go at it. It was just hilarious to watch and to see the pictures there. You ever feel like your life kind of, that captures your life? You go into it with, man, this is a high calling of God, and I'm going to do something great. And then within a few moments, it digresses to, what are we doing? Why am I doing this? This is goofy, this is silly, this is pointless. For many of us today, the reason we're weary is I don't know if we know yet if we've landed exactly where God wants us. I don't know if we know that. You may be there, but you don't know it yet. There's a rest that comes, no matter how much is laid on your plate, when you know that plate is a plate God has given you to carry, the load that's put on there. And if you don't know today the job you're doing and the family you have and the church you're stuck in and whatever else you have in your life that God has brought in, if you don't know God is in that, it will wear you out. People will annoy you. People will disappoint you. You'll begin to move away from what God has given to you. But when you know it's from Him, there's clarity that comes. There's conviction that comes. And there's a rest in knowing that God has you exactly where He wants you to be. May I say today, many of us, we have these eternal questions. Where am I going? Why am I here? What's my purpose? And there's a weariness that produces in our lives. Isaiah 26 and verse 3, you could jot down the reference, I think would help you in your own personal time. Thou will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. The focus is on God. The focus is on what He can do if we simply will trust and follow Him. The most important blessing of rest is that it replaces weary confusion about ourselves with a conviction and clarity that's all about the Lord. It's about Him, His call, His purpose, His mission for my life. All right, let's lastly end in Psalm 100, if you would go there. That kind of brings all this to a conclusion. Psalm 100, and specifically verse number 3. Psalm 100 and verse 3. As you're turning there, I was reading a study the other day about our issue with sleep. I don't know if you realize how much of our culture and the issues we have physiologically and psychologically are directly connected to our lack of sleep. The first question I ask in counseling, if you've allowed me the privilege of counseling or at least listening to what you're working through, you've heard me do this, and if you haven't yet, you'll get it within the first 5-10 minutes. How are you sleeping at night? It's one of the first questions I've learned to ask. For one thing, I want to know if you're a zombie as I'm giving you whatever else maybe of input or questions or thoughts. Sleep is so important. And the study was talking about the chronic issue of sleeplessness and how that's affecting us. And there were a lot of different statistics that were given. But it said this means 70 million Americans are not getting enough sleep, was the study. Okay, so what are we at? 330, 340 million? So we're talking a large chunk of our population is under resting. And they said, what are the results of that? How does that affect us? And they said that means 1/3 of our country is dozing off at work, napping through class, or sleeping at the wheel. And one thing that I thought was very sobering was, in the study, they said 1,500 road deaths per year are blamed on heavy-eyed truck drivers, specifically truck drivers. 1,500 road deaths per year. And I think we don't realize what we're losing as we're dozing off. If you're weary, do you know that's a stewardship issue? You will answer, and I will answer for what I'm not doing or being because I'm tired because of other wrong decisions I've made. Well, Pastor, I'm too tired to be at church other than maybe Sunday morning. I'm too tired to do this during the week. I'm too tired, wife or husband. I'm too tired, kids. Man, I do that to my boys too often. Dad's just tired. What about being the dad God wants me to be and changing some other things that need to be? Let me preach to myself for a minute there, all right? Our weariness and how that affects our stewardship, we will answer for. In Psalm 100, it gives us, I think, some hope as we confront the weariness that is not just, well, I'm busy and I'm godly and I'm doing my best, but encourages we can have different, we can know different. Look at verse 3. Verse 1, make a joyful noise on the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. Notice verse 3. Know ye that the Lord, he is God. It is he that hath made us, and not we ourselves. There's the creation. We are his sheep, or we are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. There's the redemption. He's made us. He's redeemed us. We ought to then have the tone and attitude of Psalm 100. You have, I have no excuse to not be a refueled, replenished, sing at the top of my lungs, serve with all of my heart, make a difference for eternity. We have no excuse. And some of you I know work a lot of hours. I'm not trying to give you a hard time today. I'm just saying, ask God to change that in some way. Ask God to give you wisdom as you navigate it. God does not want us to be weary. He wants us to be rested and engaged in serving him. J.I. Packer said this, quote, we are not made, nor are we redeemed to live without leisure. And where you don't have that in your life, it's costing you. And it's costing you in your relationship with Jesus Christ. Question this morning is this as we finish. Will you unload weariness by resting in God's creation? He has made you. And will you unload weariness by resting in divine redemption? He made you. He saved you. There's more than enough to sustain you in your walk and relationship with him. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for your word today. Lord, you know the disconnection between what I have just taught and preached on and how often I